Hi everyone, welcome to my tutorial on creating a hare in pastel on Pastelmat paper. So I normally use velour, as you all know, but I'm hoping to experiment a lot more on different papers, and this was my first go at an animal on Pastelmat. I've used the paper for other subject matters but never an animal, and this was a really interesting experiment, and I hope that you learn a lot from what I have to share in this tutorial. I use a mixture of Unison soft pastels and Faber Castell pencils, but of course, as always, you can use a mixture of whatever materials you have to hand. As always, I share the color codes so that you can help match to whatever colors you have in your own collection. Enjoy the tutorial. I'm bringing you in at the point at which I'm starting work on the hare. I have the background already in, and I'm going to release a tutorial on that in the next couple of weeks as well. And while velour is very different from the Pastelmat here, I did find that I could use a lot of my regular techniques on the Pastelmat. That was my aim, to try and paint pretty much how I normally paint and see how I needed to change to be able to get the effect I wanted on Pastelmat. And I begin working on the ears. I chose to try and build up that small area first, just to get a feel for the paper, get a feel for how many layers the paper could hold, get a feel for how it blends together. And I really used the ears here to experiment on making marks. But you can see in between the marks I make, I'm still rubbing in those layers. I found that the pastel does move a little more on Pastelmat than on the velour, but it was still okay to blend each of my layers well into the paper. You'll notice if you try both of those papers that on the Pastelmat you can really see your lines when you make your marks. And I found that very difficult in the background, to get things to soften and not have a hard edge. And again, for the fur, I didn't want it to look too defined, too liney, and not soft enough. So that was my concern with this paper starting out. Would I be able to create the softness that I love to get with the velour? And my first layer, I've blocked in some of the black Faber Castell stick, and now I'm using some BE36 just to add some brown tones into the darker parts of the ear. And this is some BE14, just starting to get a feel for how the light colours go on top of the dark colours on this paper, and it's really good. You can see how clear those lighter marks look, and even when I give them a soft rub, they don't completely disappear and muddy themselves into the darker colours underneath. So that those are the things that I'm testing as I'm working on the ears, seeing what I can do with the pastel, if I can create several nice clean layers, or whether I need to work differently on this paper. But so far, the only thing that's really different is the crispness of my lines. But even at this early stage, I can see that once you get a couple of layers of pastel on the paper, it's going to blend and soften together quite nicely. I'm just using the edge of the pastel to pick out the outline of the ear. The way the light is hitting the ear, I'm just looking for the places that are really highlighted, and later I'll use some shadow tones for the areas that are within the shadows. This is a little piece of A31. Again, just looking for where the light is catching, and you can see how small my marks are. Normally I wouldn't go into quite so much detail at this stage on the first area, but as I said, I'm really testing the paper here, seeing what I might need to do on the rest of the hair to make this work. And I know many of you enjoy using Pastelmat, and I suppose I feel a little silly for not having used it more often before, because I really enjoyed this experiment, and I have a few pet portraits coming up that I think would be really perfect for the effect that I can get on Pastelmat. I think for when I'm creating the bouquet backgrounds or bigger pieces of work, I still prefer the way velour allows me to blend and create really soft washes of colour. Much easier on the velour, but for the detail in a face, something where there are a lot of little defined lines, I think I'll certainly give Pastelmat another go. I have a lovely portrait of a greyhound, a brindle greyhound coming up, and I think I may well try that on the Pastelmat. So I'm using a bit of white, just picking out that brightest area on the top of the ear, and I'm really impressed by how cleanly the pastel goes on top of the other layers. That's really good. That's what you're looking for with a good pastel paper. You always want to be able to build up the layers from dark to light, and you really trust that those light colours, where you need them to be bright, will go on nice and cleanly, and this is really good for that. And after I've picked out that top line of highlight, I come in with a bit of BV7, and just inside the hare's ear here, you can see that there is a shadow area which graduates out towards where the light is hitting the edge of the ear and that faraway tip. So I'm using the BV7 first as a nice cool blue, just to start picking out the brighter part of the inside of the ear. And I find that the Unison pastels work really nicely on this paper. They go on with such solid colour, you can really see your marks. But I can imagine that you could get away with using some pastels that are a little softer even than on the velour. So perhaps your Senneliers, Rembrandts aren't too soft, they're a little harder than Unisons. But the Senneliers and the Schminkies, I think they would work fine on this paper as well. I tend to avoid those brands on the velour as they're a bit too soft. But it's hard to beat my Unisons. They break down into such nice little shards that I can get small little marks like this. I'm just constantly moving the pastel around, finding another sharp edge to use. And I use BE14 here. On top of that dark layer, I can start to build up a bit of texture. But with an animal, most animals, but especially something like this hare, you can really see how thick the fur is, and you're never going to create that effect from 2 or even 3 layers of pastel. You really have to come back over each area again and again with little marks like this, layering it up so that it genuinely looks really thick. And now using a little piece of BE19 here, I start to flick some of these lighter hairs along that edge of the ear. And this is done quite roughly, still searching for a sharp edge on the pastel. And I know I'll come back to things like this with the pastel pencil perhaps. And I just go along this quite loosely and then blend into the layer beneath. You can see how little it moves. It's quite like the velour in that sense, that it really holds on to the pastel and it doesn't smudge all over the place. You can retain quite a lot of control on this paper, a bit like the velour as well. So if you're using some other types of pastel paper where your pastel seems to get very messy very quick and blends too easily and gets very muddy with the layers beneath, I would really recommend you try out some Pastelmat, as I'm always recommending it to beginners as it seems to have the best of all worlds in one paper. And I'm back in with some BV8 now, getting a little darker with the blues as I go towards the inside of the ear. And I chose to use blues in my shadow tones in this piece. There's going to be a lot of oranges throughout the fur of the hair, and also bringing in some of the lovely orangey yellows from the background. The blue should make a really nice contrast to that warmth. Again, thinking of that colour theory, using your opposite colours within the painting. Just finding that nice warm tip of the ear that's catching some sunlight. And you can see when I come in with a little bit of pure white here, how nice and cleanly that goes on top of those other colours and how well it shows up. Now I use some BV15 for right inside the ear, where the shadow of those hairs along the ridge of the ear are making it quite a lot darker. So I look for a nice blue tone, blue violet. And as always, I'm not too fussy about how it goes on. Around the edges of the hair I try to be as neat as possible, but you can see that even with a big stick you can always find a small edge. And again with the BV8, just softening and blending into the BV15 underneath. And I come back in with the white just to pick out the brightest of the highlights down that area. If you really pay attention to where sunlight is hitting and where your highlights really aren't the brightest, you can quite easily create a 3D effect. I think colour value is the most important part of painting. Even if your proportions are slightly off, having the correct colour values will still make the painting work. And at this point I pick up my dark pastel pencil, black pastel pencil, and I start to feather some of that darkness out into my BV15. So we're doing a little bit of gradual shading from the ear. And it's a really nice paper to blend on. Once you get a couple of layers of pastel down, the layers, the more hard you press on them, they really will blend together. And at this point that's what I'm experimenting with, just seeing how much I can get those lighter marks on top to sink into the layer below. And seeing how the paper works if I want to come back in with my pastel pencil and add more definition to an area. So I really did use these ears to experiment on, get a feel for the paper and how it works. And now one of my favourite colours, yellow 15. And just around this top part of the head, where the sunlight's hitting the hair, you can really see a lot of vibrant colours throughout the fur. And so I'm just picking out that top layer using the yellow 15. It will mix nicely in amongst the other colours in the fur. But I really want to add a good touch of vibrance to this fur. And just where the ears meet the head, I'm looking for all those little ridges that are catching the light, using some white here. Just picking out that little curve that leads up towards the top of the head. But it really is so easy to get definition on this paper. At this stage, my main concern is still whether it will look convincingly soft like fur. And I come back in with some BV7 here. Just adding another layer onto the top of that ear. And the pastel pencil goes on the paper quite nicely too. I can see why people use only pastel pencil on Pastelmat. However, I would miss the vibrance of the colour and the freedom of the soft pastel sticks. I enjoy feeling a little more painterly in my style, which I think is why I have avoided Pastelmat a little bit. I, in my own art journey, have been trying to steer away from high levels of detail, really small, fiddly, every single hair kind of detail. That hasn't really been my style as I've progressed. I suppose I'm most influenced by the Impressionist artists, who really used loose marks, but their colour values were perfect and it always created a strange photorealistic effect from a distance. But when you got up close, the marks were so lively and interesting, and I think this is where I've been heading towards, and maybe going in the other direction from a really high level detail. But I still love working this way, and for my portraits and certain subject matters, the detail is fantastic. But it may not be a paper that I would come to if I were trying to loosen up and become more painterly. One thing I didn't like about the background was the fact that every mark you make is very defined and very viewable. It was hard to add a thin film of colour anywhere, but I'll talk more about that in my background tutorial. For the actual hair itself, I really found the paper fantastic for the amount of detail I could add. And now I'm back in with my black Faber Castell stick, and I start to pick out some of the other structure on the hare's face. Looking for the darkest areas, taking note of all those different directions of fur. And once I've got a couple of layers of black and dark brown across the fur like before on the ear, I use a little bit of BE31, a nice light yellowy tint, and start to pick out that highlight across the top of the hare's other eye. And switching to white for the next part of that highlight, just where it's at its most contrasted. And it's nice to have a little bit of darkness in the background behind the hair here, as that will really help the effect of the hair standing out well from the background, make the subject really pop. And I use a brown pastel pencil here just to create some of those finest hairs around the top of the head. And back in with that BE31, and for the next few moments I work a lot of different colours over the top of the hare's head. Lots of small marks in the direction of the fur, building up each layer and blending each layer into the one below. And now I take some light coloured pastel pencil and I can start working on those edges, flicking tiny hairs, softening the divide between the highlight and the dark area. and just generally making some of those little hairs around the edges a little more random, make them stick out more. And this is just what I would do on the velour paper, exactly the same. Use the softer pastel around the edges, then come back with the pastel pencil and really flick that out from the fur. Now I use some yellow 18, bringing some of those lovely light colours from the background into the fur of the hare. So always try to bring some of those exact shades that you used in your background into your main subject. It's something I say all the time, but it's so important for creating that nice colour harmony across the whole piece. And you can see how those marks soften quite nicely there when I rub them. I come back in with some pastel pencil just to make finer adjustments. This is my BE31. And you can see that as I work, I usually have a place to rest my hand. This was asked on YouTube this week, how I can hover and make marks, but I of course don't all the time. In this case, when I work from the top down, I always leave myself some blank paper where I can anchor my hand. But I think as you do get more used to the feel of the pastels and making marks with them, you do get a little more free. I find I make a lot of marks on my pieces without leaning on the page. And just don't be scared to loosen up a little, even though what I'm doing here is quite tight detail and small marks. But it really is a necessity on the top of the hare's head where the hairs are at their shortest. And it's so tricky around the top of the head, all of those bulges and eyebrows and different parts of the skull. The fur really does seem to flow in about 100 different directions over the skull of a hare. And it's just about noticing every little change of direction. And over the next few moments, I'm just starting to pick out some of the highlighted structure down this right side of the face. And it's so important as it forms the hare's expression, that eyebrow. And I want to get the look on the hare's face just right. And it's not just about getting the eye done accurately. Every piece of fur surrounding the eye all contributes to the expression of the animal, especially if you're painting a pet portrait. Really pay attention to all of the structure around the eye, not just putting the focus on getting the likeness through the eyes alone. And in some ways, the Pastelmat paper, I found it a little irritating that each individual mark was so visible. But once I found I could blend, it really was quite a nice effect to get, to be able to retain a lot of the detail if you want. In some ways, I'm always working towards getting the detail on velour, and I think on Pastelmat it was more about trying to get rid of some of the detail, trying to soften it, make it look more natural. And I used some BE35 there, just adding in some darker tones before coming up into the highlight colours. And using some BE31 and later a piece of BV7, I start to try and join this ear onto the hare's face. I'm just following the flow of the fur, and it was actually BV8 that I pick up next, just where the ear turns the corner down into the cooler light, and I add some of my BV8. This is a nice piece of pastel. It's obviously been dropped or broken, and it creates so many nice sharp edges. Now I start to pick out some of the top of the eyebrow here, using a little piece of white just to mark that curve in. And now in with some yellow 6, one of my colours from the buttercups, just adding some nice splashes of vibrance through that sunlit fur on the top of the hare's head. So using some BV8, I start to pick out the far side of the hare's face. And I'm using that lovely blue tone, as this side of the hare's face is the most in shadow. So you can see the sunlight coming along behind the hare, hitting its back, the top of its head. But when you compare that with the left side of the face, the colours down there are much cooler. So I'm getting the outline in using this nice light blue. And then coming back in with the pastel pencil just to add some of the little darker hairs you can see at the very outside of the face. And I'll come back and do more of the whiskers and finer hairs around the hare's face later on. I'm also bringing out a how-to this month about how to do whiskers. There are many different techniques used by different artists. I have my own ways that I normally use, nothing very fancy, so I hope I can share a few simple tips with you to get nice crisp whiskers. But here I'm just using the pastel pencil to tweak at this outer shape and start to think about where that eye socket disappears around the corner. And now using some A26, I start to build up some of the texture on that far side of the face. So you can see a lot of the marks I'm making are very repetitive. It's more to do with the color choices, which creates the 3D effect. Using some BE8 just to add a little bit of warmth over there. And just studying my photo reference very closely. And it's quite easy on the Pastelmat to come back in with the pencil if you feel that you've lost some of the definition between the hairs. It's nice and easy to get that back on this paper. And for the next while, I spend some time making these areas a little darker before adding some highlight hairs. Then coming back in with the colours I've been using all along and continuing to add some more texture up the front of the face. Now using some of that BE31, I start to lighten the top of this eyebrow. So you can see the highlighted colour along the top ridge of the eyebrow, leading down to the warmer yellowy tones towards the eyelid. And then back in with a pastel pencil, I can easily go round and define that edge nicely. I now use some BE35 on my lower layer again. I'll show you how I work around the eye area, but if you haven't already seen it, on my YouTube channel I have a full length 20-minute video on how I did the eye, so I try to keep these tutorials as brief as possible while giving you the most amount of information, so sometimes splitting the tutorial up into different sections is helpful for me as well as hopefully for you, so be sure to check out the full eye tutorial on the YouTube channel. So at this stage I've just blocked in the main shape of the eye again in case I start to lose the overall shape of it. And now I'm using a very small shard of soft white pastel just to pick out this small visible line of fur down the right side of the eye. And also strengthening the highlight along the top ridge of the eyebrow. As I come round that shape of the eyebrow, I notice that the marks fan around in the direction, and I try to do the same thing with my tiny piece of pastel, turning it as I come around the corner, making those marks always in the direction of the fur. Taking some BE14 now and starting to bring some of that fur down the front of the nose. Again, very small marks, always looking for where the root of the hair is. And going back, strengthening some of those brightest highlights with my white pastel. And I bring some of my BV8, that nice light blue, down this side of the eye as well. As you can see, where the sunlight reaches to, and then to the left of the eye just seems a bit cooler, like it's in shadow. And it's just noticing those little areas where your highlight goes from bright white to perhaps quite a cool blue. And I find the pastel pencils great on this paper. I think you can get a bit more of a line from the pastel pencils on this paper perhaps than on the velour paper, but I still find that with light colours the pencils are very wishy-washy, you don't get very strong colour from them. I still find the most vibrance comes from those soft pastels. But the pencils really are great for tweaking what you've done, making the ends of the hairs even finer. And I can go back through the fur with some darker pencil and add a bit more depth where I need to. So it's very versatile, not unlike the velour in a lot of ways. This is very similar to how I work on it. If anything, my detail and definition are much easier maintained on the Pastelmat. So I've skipped on a little bit. You can see I've started to build up some of the ground layers on the bottom of the face in exactly the same way as the top of the head, adding in your darker marks. And nothing on the bottom of the face is really finished just yet, as before I do the cheeks and the edges of the face, I really need to get some neck area in there for that to go on top of. So I start again with the black Faber Castell, just looking for the general direction of the fur, and I start to mark in some of the darkness around the neck. And after I've blocked in some of those lower layers of fur on the body, I come back in with my lovely yellow 15 and start to add some of that vibrant backlit hair behind the ears. And I use a little shard of my Red Earth 10. Some lovely warm orangey brown tones throughout this fur. And now I use some BE16, bringing some of those directional fur marks down around the chest of the hare. Again, I'm just in the habit of always rubbing those marks into the paper, and I found that to be a great technique for the pastel mat too, as once you start adding too many layers onto the surface of the paper without blending any of it together, it can start getting a little difficult to achieve the detail when you give them a light rub together. It just seems to leave some more space on the surface of the paper to add another layer. Also, when it's something like fur that you're painting and you want that soft effect, I found I could rub quite a lot on this paper and it still retained its hard edges, those hard lines. So I just go along looking for the direction of the fur, which on a hare's body is pretty crazy. It seems to sprout out of everywhere and go in every direction. So I'm just really following the muscle structure. And I often find that with portraiture, with animal portraiture, so many artists put a huge amount of effort into the face and the eyes in particular, the parts that they perhaps enjoy painting the most. But I always think that the body and the neck and every area is equally important, and it's good to devote as much time to those areas almost as you would to the all-important face. So I use some of that BE16 around the rest of the face, starting to build up that thick cheek of fur. And I'm also looking for that nice highlight down the right side of the cheek, really starting to bring the hare's face into 3D. My thanks to the photographer who shot the hare, Steve Ward. It's a photographer who I sourced via Flickr. If any of you are familiar with Flickr, I often go on there and have a look through reference photos and then get in contact with the photographer whose work I would like to use as reference, and I'll often offer them a payment for use of their image. Sometimes I've paid by giving them a finished print of my painting, but it's always worth having a look, and it's nice to support some local photographers as well. There are lots of free reference photos out there, but I always like to search for something a little different, something that I haven't seen painted lots of times already, and this one really jumped out. And I took the opportunity just to have a bit of an experiment on the Pastelmat paper with the background. I had just completed my buttercup hare on the velour paper, so I wanted to do something to be able to compare the two. I just continue using a mixture of the soft pastel, coming back in with the pastel pencil, redefining some of those finest hairs. And this is something I wanted to show you at this stage, just going back over what I've done and really giving it quite a good rub, not being too forceful, but you can see how much you can actually rub the pastel on this paper, and it doesn't lose its definition, but it certainly does soften nicely into the layers underneath. And that's something that I did quite a lot of, even at the end of the painting. I went back over it with my finger and tried to soften a lot of the marks, make it look a little less contrasted and a little more natural. So this is what I'm doing here, just taking some time and trying to blend those hairs into each other a little more. Then I've picked up my black Faber Castell stick again. It's a little harder than the Unisons. And I'm just going to go throughout the coat and really heighten any of those darker areas. Making sure I've got enough contrast. Now, using a little bit of white, I start to pick out some of the highlight running up the hare's face towards the eye. And I don't lean too heavily with the white here, unlike some other areas. Just a little hint of highlight You can always choose the strength of your mark by leaning lightly and blending it into the layer underneath. Or if you need something to be really pure white, like those highlights along the top of the ears or the top line of the eyebrow, in those areas I would lean a good bit heavier. But it's lovely just to layer up these small marks and still be able to see a hint of my marks underneath, which is just what you want for creating realistic fur. And I switch to BV7 as that strip of lighter fur comes up closer to the eye. Just a little hint of it disappearing into a bit of shadow close to that corner of the eye. And again, trying to get my marks to really turn the corner and start heading over in the direction of the cheek. So there are so many little ridges of fur where the direction changes on the face. It really is one of the more complicated animals to paint, I find, just because of all the crazy directions of fur. And I continue with some BE31 here, really starting to fill in some of the gaps up the front of the face. And at this stage, the fur on this area starts to look pretty good. You can see those extra few layers really start to make it look nice and thick and natural. And for the next few moments, I continue working down the front of the face onto the nose. Now that area has the smallest marks on it with the shortest hairs. So it takes me a little while just to build up that nice, thick, soft texture on the nose. Now with my BE16, I continue to work across the face towards the cheek, and will start to pick out some of the colours around the hare's mouth. And when I look at the chin of the hare in the photo reference, I can see a nice green or yellowy tint to the chin, just because of that green grass reflecting underneath the hare's chin. And I definitely want to have some of that in this piece, especially with so much yellow around the hair. So I pick up some yellow 5, one of the colours I've used in the buttercups, and start to add some of those whisker areas with a nice glow of yellow to it. And I continue on now with BE16, blocking in some of that front chest hair underneath the chin. And you can see with the dark layers of black and some darker BE6 brown, once I add this lighter, warm orangey brown on top, it already starts to resemble the flow of the fur. And I spend the next few moments just blocking in the front part of the chest. And at this point I've skipped on a little bit. I've used those same highlight colours, BE31, BE19, little bits of white, all down the side of the hare's face, just like I did on the top of the head, picking out those highlight areas. And that's quite repetitive. I thought I wanted to show you a bit more of the hare's body, as the fur here behaves quite differently from on the face. So at this point especially, I'm noticing how this ripple of fat comes round the hare's back, and how I can add these lighter hairs with the darkness in between to really show the flow of the fur and the flesh underneath. And I use BE14 here, constantly looking at the photo reference and thinking about the direction of each individual hair. Try not to make it look too uniformed. As I've said before, on wild animals especially, you'll find your marks need to be much more haphazard to make them look more natural. And I've worked a good bit of the body now, putting in those lighter little patches using BE14, and I come back in with some bits of BE19 and BE31, like here. Trying to add a little curve to each mark, just to show the flow of each individual hair. If you make your marks too straight, it's going to look a little false and you won't get that realistic 3D flow of the fur. And all the time just blending those top layers into the lower layers, trying to soften the look of the Pastelmat a bit. But as I got working more on the fur on this paper, I really found I like it simply for the amount of detail you can fit in. It's great for super detail, especially in a close-up portrait like this. And with a few more highlights added, I can come back in, add more of the finishing touches, warmer bits of RE15. Really now just able to focus on adding colour to the coat, touches of vibrance here and there. And picking up some smaller shards of pastel. This is RE15. Just adding some more warmer marks through the coat. I don't want it to look too cold. And I can take this opportunity to really feather some of those marks, break up some of the darker areas. But really on the Pastelmat, the biggest bonus I think is how clearly those dark areas continue to shine through the lighter layers. It really is a bit easier to keep the crisp definition of the fur. But in my own opinion, I think this can sometimes lead to an image looking a bit static and not very much movement in it. So I still love the velour for its softness, the soft edges you can create. I found I could be a lot more painterly. And I think once I started this on Pastelmat, I just had to embrace the fact that each individual line was so defined and visible, and just figure out a way to try and soften that look. And the way I've done that is through many layers, small marks, and you can see I come back through with some black Faber Castell stick again. And from this point, it's just about tweaking, making small adjustments, picking out little hairs that are being caught by the light. And here I use a little bit of white, just for that area around the neck that's catching the light. And again, like on velour, giving each of the marks a little rub into the paper. If I hadn't rubbed all of these layers in, I think it would look very liney and coarse. The coat would look very harsh. Also, the pastel would still be sitting sort of on the surface of the paper, not quite so much as on velour. But I do think the blending is necessary on the Pastelmat as well. I know many of you use Pastelmat, so I'm looking forward to experimenting on it a bit more and bringing you some more tutorials. The next piece I'm filming on Pastelmat is the Greyhound I mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial. So it will be nice to show you how to build up a brindle coloured coat. I know a few of you have asked for that. Something that's very useful in a lot of different dog types and some other types of animal too. And I go around now with the white pastel, picking out some of those brightest highlights. Really, it's hard to know when to stop on Pastelmat, as I could have continued to add little bits of minute detail for a long time. And the final touches can be done with the light coloured pastel pencil. Again, I find the pastel pencil, the light colours especially, they don't really go on to the paper that well in terms of strength of colour, but they are great for the little fine edges. A few final marks of BE8 just to add some warmth around this cheek. And I hope you've really enjoyed this tutorial. I look forward to working on Pastelmat again. I will include the reference photo for this hair in a link on the Patreon channel, so keep an eye out there for that if you want to have a go at this hair yourself. I'd love to see what some of you decide to do with the background, whether you choose to keep it the green as it is in the photo reference, or try something lively and experimental like I did. So good luck with your own hairs, and until next time, happy pasteling!